Achan's sin. We hear often about God's loving kindness towards us. We must remember that because God is so full of love, he cannot tolerate sin. He knows how much it harms and hurts us. In the story today, we see just how much harm and damage sin can do. In the story last week, we heard how Joshua and God's army conquered Jericho in an amazing way. If you remember, the men were told not to take any of the plunder for themselves. They were to put all the valuable things from Jericho into God's treasury. This was to acknowledge that it was God's battle and God's victory. In spite of God's command, Achan, one of the soldiers, took some precious things and kept them for himself. He even hid them in his tent with his family. I wonder how he could do such a thing, to lie and steal from God. Did he think God couldn't see what he had done? Did he think God wouldn't mind? Or maybe he didn't believe in God at all. Whichever was true, it had terrible results and consequences. The next city to fight against was a small city called Ai. Joshua was advised not to send the whole army to fight against it because there weren't many men in this city. So Joshua sent off a small army. What a shock Joshua and Israel had. They lost the battle. Joshua's small army had to flee for their lives, and 36 men were killed. When the army returned, Joshua and the leaders of Israel knelt with their faces to the ground before the Ark of the Covenant. Joshua cried to the Lord, how could they lose their second battle when God had promised victory all the time? Now the whole community of Israel were shaking with fear. What was going to happen to them if God wasn't going to help them? After a whole day, God answered Joshua with the news that someone had stolen from him. Until the stolen goods were returned and the culprit punished, God would not be with him. It was up to Joshua to find out and deal with it. The very next day, Joshua set about finding out who was the one who had stolen from God. It wasn't long before God let him know it was Achan. Achan came trembling before Joshua and admitted that he had indeed stolen gold and silver and a rug which he had hidden in his tent. These stolen items were returned to God. But what about Achan? It was because of him that Israel had suffered a dreadful defeat. They had been shamed. And what about the 36 men who had lost their lives? So Joshua, with God's full approval, had Achan executed. They put a mound of stones over his grave as a reminder that God is holy and will not turn a blind eye to such sin. This is God's justice, his perfect and good justice. And because of this, sin must always be punished by death. This is why we all die. We are all born sinners. But the good news is that the Lord Jesus paid the price of sin when he died on the cross. So even though we will all die at some time, we can pass right through death to live forever in heaven with him. All God asks of us is to accept his payment on our behalf. Wow! This shows us how merciful and kind God is. This is love at its best. How could we refuse such an offer? Be sure that your sin will find you out. Numbers 32, verse 23.
He made the stars.